conspiracy theories as a jumping off point with which to teach his students to think critically. With us is a biology teacher from Waimea College in Nelson, Roger Waddell. Roger, kia ora, welcome to the panel.
Kia ora, Wallace and Julia and Peter.
Kia ora, Roger.
Nice to have you on. So, interesting. We thought this might be a bit of a solution to this intractable problem of the surmounting issue of conspiracy. So tell us what you do with your students. How do you go about addressing this issue?
So, first of all, today I carried out a wee survey on my Year 12 biology students. Now, remember, they're 16 or 17 years old, and it was about living in the world of conspiracy theories. So, bear in mind that science is no longer compulsory in many schools beyond Year 10. I mean, that's another conversation. But these particular students have got a few years of being critical thinkers. So, they're pretty savvy, you know. They tend to know if the wool is being pulled over their eyes, and even in a world where everything is so uncertain, and they can pretty much see through the digital fog. So, I from the survey, I got sort of 4 key insights. And the first thing is they can rattle off heaps of conspiracy theories, like way more than me. They're pretty immersed in it. 16, they could just tell you, things that I would never know of. And when they tend to encounter conspiracy theories, they're quite open-minded, actually. They're pretty aware that it influences people to make poor decisions and that it undermines real science and scientists, and then I asked them, well, what skills or tools do you employ, to be a critical thinker? And they said, well, it's simple, you just use your brain. And they also use a thing called the CRAP test. Now, that's, incidentally, it's got 2 A's in the middle, and it's a tool by how they can analyse data and misinformation that's given them. So they're pretty tuned into it, really. And in biology, we actually teach a unit called Analyse the Biological Validity of Information. And so they'll look at topics like anti-vaccination, 1080, dairying and stream health, and they look at cognitive bias and cherry picking. So, right throughout school generally, there's been a huge change, probably since your panellists have been at school. I don't know.
Oh, interesting.
We teach a thing called Nature of Science about being a critical thinker. So, it's all happening, really.
How fantastic. So you take apart topics such as vaccination, 1080, stream health, other things like that. And then what do? Do you look at the data, take it apart, and then discuss it?
Yeah, so they need to source, say, 3 different articles, one which may be representative of something that's obviously biased, something that has supposedly got accurate information in it, and then they'll apply these sort of tools that we teach them about just to tease out, is this fact, is this fiction, what's the agenda behind that particular article, what's a vested interest, all that sort of thing, really, and hopefully, I said they're pretty savvy anyway, but they start to see through that fog.
Gosh, able to rattle off just at a moment's breath 16 conspiracy theories. How interesting. It sounds a bit of a far cry from when I was doing science, Roger, but tell me, are the students engaged in this type of study? Do they find it interesting?
Oh, look, they love it. So, this is so embedded in social media that's their platform of life, really. So they're constantly exposed and, as I said, immersed in all of these conspiracy theories. And I quite like the idea that they said, no, we shouldn't censor too much. It is freedom of speech.
I see.
We've got the skills. Trust us. Okay, post some warnings up, work to educate people, but look, don't bring down the heavy duty guns on censorship, they're saying.
Interesting. Julia Whaipuri, what do you make of this?
Well, I'm not surprised that in the survey you had all these young people who could just rattle off all these conspiracies, because in the age of social media and the exposure that many people, especially our young people, I'm old now. I'm 32, and I didn't really grow up from in the age of social media. So I'm just outside that, being a digital native. But I think about a couple of years ago, the Children's Commission spoke with a lot of young people about what were the things concerning them most in the world and all of that. And it was a surprise to see that many of them had an issue that came up that was quite pressing for many was Donald Trump building a wall in New Zealand. And so it's like it's when we have platforms like Facebook, mainly Facebook here, and actually young people now using TikTok and all of that kind of stuff, where you don't have someone to help you consume the information that you're given. We're creating quite a vulnerable time where people, social media can just publish whatever they want, really, and then it's left up to the individuals to be able to consume what's in front of them. And I think that there are actually, like, you look at a report that came out. It's from some flash uni over in the States, Princeton or something. Yeah, it was Princeton, actually. I don't know if that's in the States. They came out and said, one of the biggest things that people seek are they buy into conspiracies, are those who are lonely and seeking connection and meaning. And that can be a larger part of our societies than we know. So it is something that we want to help people consume information better and actually put on more constraints on social media.
Do you have a comment, Peter Elliott, for Roger?
Yeah, I mean, we had a Russian-led troll network that was in West Africa that came up, I think it was a few months back, that basically was a bunch of young people that were putting a whole lot of just fallacious stories out on the net. It didn't matter what their content was, as long as they got hits, because they ended up getting paid for it, and it was a way they were making money. And these things flooded the net for quite some time and continue to do so. But there is an attractiveness to being the first to market, being the first to grab a story. There is an attractiveness to explaining the world that social media seems to propagate. Is that part of that thing that the young people do? Do they also like to disprove the bullshit, as it were, as well?
Well, I guess, I've not necessarily got full insight into the minds of a teenager who does. But, they certainly seem to want to be first off the rank, if you like. The first.
Righty-ho. I'll just give you a minute to get ready. Just let me know when you are. Good afternoon, everyone. As you're aware, the High Court has released its decision in the Borrowdale case today. They found that all of the orders that have been made under the Health Act were valid. They've rejected the argument that the Crown could not put orders in place in respect of the whole of the country. They've rejected the idea that we couldn't have bubbles in place for the whole of the country or close businesses down. They've also found against Mr Borrowdale in respect of the assertion that there was a delegation of responsibilities to find what was an essential business. They have found in favour of Mr Borrowdale in respect of the issue as to whether the requirement to stay at home should have been in a written order earlier than the 3rd of April, and have given a declaration in respect of that, although they have noted that the requirement to stay at home was reasonable and proportionate. They just think it should have been in the written order earlier. I'm happy to answer questions.
What are the consequences of the unlawful finder in the context of what you just said about validation?
We've got no plan to pass validating legislation. We don't think it's necessary. The orders are all fine. The effects on businesses, of course, were in respect of the early order, which closed down all business premises other than essential services.
So will there be any practical response or implications as a result of this judgment?
No.
I think that was just the same question I was going to ask, but are there any consequences to this finding?
No, we don't think so. We think that it's good that the Crown's won all of, from our perspective, the most important points.
Any lessons, though, in terms of legislative process from now on? And I know that obviously other legislation has been passed since, but what do you take from that in terms of what you should have maybe done, or what the government should have done legally?
Well, the judgment also says that it was appropriate that specific legislation in response to COVID was passed as was, and they note that approvingly in the judgment. What we were trying to do during those early days was take the people with us, really, from a point where there were very few restrictions to, in little over a week, having very, completely, how should I put it, going from a point of very few restrictions on the 25th of March to a little over a week later having very broad restrictions on businesses and how people live their lives. The court said that the language that was used by different representatives of the government was effectively directive and should have been backed up by a written order to stay at home earlier than the 3rd of April.
Are there any consequences for any charges?
Sorry?
Hindsight, would you have done things differently, or do you feel like it was necessary to move at that pace given the circumstances?
Well, the judgment, you can see that the court's gone to a lot of effort to actually record the fact that this was an emergency, that things had to be done quickly, and that the orders to stay at home in bubbles were proportionate. They just think it should have been written down a little bit earlier.
Are there any individuals or interactions with law enforcement affected, like were there any arrests, convictions, or anything at all that would be changed?
No, we've checked on that. I've got the number here. There were 15 charges that were laid under the Health Act during that first 9 days before the 3rd of April, and none of them were for offences that were affected by the 3 April order. They were all for things like business premises being open when they shouldn't have been. So during that period, the police were taking an educative approach and they weren't prosecuting people for breach of their bubbles.
Is there any possibility of any legal action being taken against government by a business that would have lost business, for example, because of they lost customers because of the illegal after the lockdown?
Well, the court says it was a finely balanced issue as to whether they should issue a declaration. The issue as to whether there should ever be damages pursuant to the Bagents case for a breach of the Bill of Rights is an issue for the future, but I would think it would be very unlikely that there's much risk for the Crown in that.
Given this findings, is this whole legal exercise a bit of a waste of everyone's time?
Look, I'm not going to say that. I think when things happen that are as serious as has happened during COVID, it's quite proper that the determinations as to where the law sits are for the courts, and it's the right of individuals to take their issues to the court and have them heard. So no, I'm not critical of people for having done that, although I have heard some people say it's a waste of time and money. I think these are very important issues, and I think it's appropriate for the courts to consider them. I beg your pardon? For me personally, I address the issues at every stage in the proceedings, but of course the government's represented by the Solicitor General and the legal counsel that are employed by them. So, I wouldn't want to overemphasise that. There's been some time, but it hasn't kept us from doing what we need to do to prevent the COVID epidemic.
In those early days and in between that initial order and the April 3rd order, did you receive any legal advice that indicated that that first order was insufficient in the manner by which the judgment is described?
I was always confident that we had the right basis for the legal orders. One of the points that was put by the Crown to the court was that there were enforcement powers under the civil defence emergency legislation, which the court has disagreed with in pretty brief terms, and that's one of the issues that we'll be considering before we decide whether we'll appeal the judgment.
Looking at the new... Sorry, did you receive any advice during that time that indicated that that first order might be insufficient also? Did any go through?
Well, we've always reviewed the orders on the way through and supplemented them as we thought appropriate, but we always thought we were acting legally all of the way through.
With the new legislation that was passed a couple of weeks ago, will that give you the flexibility to be able to vary what happens at respective alert levels?
Yes, that's one of the benefits of the replacement legislation or the specific COVID legislation, is it enables more fine-grained responses, including at level 2. The powers under the Health Act were adequate for levels 3 and 4, but the advice that we received was that we needed more particular powers at lower levels, including level 2, which the COVID Response Bill or the COVID Response Act contains.
Why were some of these verbal instructions not put down on paper at the beginning?
Because we didn't think it necessary. The government was trying to take people from a state of no restrictions to heavy restrictions inside a period of a week. We thought the orders that were made were sufficient, and that we didn't think it was necessary to make the specific order in respect of staying in home in your bubbles until the 3rd of April.
Why not? Because police were out there and there was
Well, I think that's it's evident from the fact that the police didn't prosecute anyone in those that early week and a bit, that they were taking that graduated approach, and it wasn't until the 3rd of April that they started to take a stricter enforcement approach, by which time we thought we'd carried the people with us for the need to have that enforcement. No, I don't think so, because remember, we also thought we had powers under the civil defence legislation.
When you said we thought, was the other answer that, we thought that it was all okay? Was there no advice sought on that? Was that just a cabinet position?
I know the government had legal advice, and the
legal advice that it was fine.
I can't speak to all of the legal advice that the Director General or the police had at the time. Suffice it to say that the government thought that all of the steps that were taken were legal.
Why can you not be transparent about whether the advice that you've given told you whether you were in the right or not? I'm not dodging that. I just haven't seen all of the advice. So I haven't seen all of the advice that would have been prepared by. You would want to know, given that there's been a court judgment here, whether what you were provided, which made you feel satisfied to push ahead, was advice that meant that you were in the right.
Yes, and I believe that that has been upheld, that all of the notices that were issued by the government were legal. The main point in this case has been the allegation that it was beyond the power of the government under the Health Act to have notices that kept everyone in their bubble, or notices that closed every business down in the country other than essential services. And the court has upheld the right of the Crown to do that.
I understand no decision has been taken yet about an appeal, but what's the time frame in the process for deciding that decision?
Can I get back to you on that? Can you remember what the time for appeal is normally, Kate? 20 working days? I'll check that and get back to you. Generally those decisions are taken by me on advice of the Solicitor General, and I haven't received that advice yet.
Were you made aware of any point of advice that the Director General of Health or Police received that indicated that first order was in any way insufficient?
Ask that again.
So were you made aware at any point that the Director General of Health or Police had received other advice that indicated that this initial order was insufficient?
No, but I was aware by the time of the 3rd of April order that the Crown thought that we were wise to put in place the 3rd of April order because we were moving to a stricter compliance regime in respective bubbles, which was expressly referred to in the 3 April order.
So just to clarify that, though, what you're saying is that you can't categorically say that no advice was received saying you're in wrong because you haven't seen it all, but that you did get advice on the 3rd of April saying that you should do this because...
No, I'm saying that all the advice that I had until the 3rd of April was that we were on the right side of the law, but that nonetheless it was prudent to put in place the 3rd of April order. No, it doesn't.
If you need to do something to be on the right side of the track, that would suggest you are on the wrong side of the track.
No, I don't agree with that. No.
So the advice on the 3rd of April didn't in any way indicate that there was any unlawful aspect of the application prior to the initial order?
Correct.
So there was no, distinction made by lawyers or anything between the difference between verbal orders and what was initially.
Well, the point that the court made was that, the proposition that the Crown put to the court was that the requests that were made of New Zealanders to stay in their bubble weren't directive in a legal sense. They were requests. The court in the judgment, and it does it quite carefully, and it's worth reading, notes that the language changed during that week, and it became more directive, and more people were making the language more directive. And so on that basis, the court says that people who heard that language were rightly thinking that they were being directed rather than asked, and that therefore the order that was made on the 3rd of April in the view of the court should have been made earlier.
So, I guess, surely legal advisors would have seen the emerging difference been said and what had actually been authorised on paper in the communique?
Look, I think the judgment speaks for itself in that regard. You can see the position that the Crown put and that the conclusions that the court made.
But presumably
people who broke their bubbles before April 3rd might have had it and might not have been breaking the law.
Well, from the point of view of the Crown, we thought we had powers of enforcement under the civil defence legislation, but the court, in a very brief passage in the judgment, disagrees with that. So that's one of the issues that I'll be taking advice from the Solicitor General from. Sorry? The enforcement of conduct that put people at risk, yes. Yeah.
presumably the wording of the publicity, etc., in the prior to April the 3rd came through the All of Government Committee, which reported to a Cabinet Committee. So was that Cabinet Committee vetting the material that was coming from the All of Government Committee, or were they left to publish on their own devices?
I'll have to check on that to see what the Cabinet records show of that. In respect of the person who had the power to make orders under the Health Act, as those orders were then made, it was the Director General of Health who made those orders, not Cabinet.
Are you, like the Deputy Prime Minister, very frustrated with the speed of trade talks with the UK?
No, obviously we want them to go as fast as they can, but we recognise that it's difficult for the United Kingdom to close a deal with New Zealand before they've closed their deal with the European Union, which is a more important deal to them and to a certain extent defines the breadth of freedom of choice that they've got in their negotiation with New Zealand.
Do you understand? First 9 days of the lockdown, those issues there, was there perhaps a miscommunication or a lack of communication between the Director General and whose name this notice was in, and the government in terms of what the government was saying that notice was telling them to do?
No, I don't think so. I think it's very easy to look back and go over every word and judge it with the benefit of hindsight. We were responding urgently. I think the court, again, I think it's interesting that the court has gone to the trouble of recording how rapidly this pandemic was moving in the world and in New Zealand. And I think the reason they've done that is to reinforce what it is that they say in their judgment, which is, I think I wrote some of their quotes down. In fact, I think I reproduced them in the press release, which is to say that the requirement to stay at home and in their bubbles was a necessary, reasonable and proportionate response to COVID-19, and that these things must be seen in the context of the rapidly developing public health emergency the nation was facing. And the court also made the point that these things have to be kept in perspective. The situation lasted, this fine point lasted for just 9 days and occurred when New Zealand was in a state of emergency fighting a global pandemic. So I think their language has been quite careful here not to be too critical.
Did the Director General of Health seek advice from you as Attorney General in that period when he was issuing the health orders before April the 3rd?
Not from me personally. The advice comes from the Solicitor General, but yes, the Ministry of Health would have had advice from Crown Law.
Why not the Prime Minister was Cabinet's representative at the time making the statements? Why not have her here today explaining the government's response to this as well?
She's got plenty to do today without reading a long judgment like this and getting her head around the finer legal detail, and she thought that I was a better person to answer these questions.
And so just finally on my trade question, what progress can you report on those talks?
Early rounds of negotiation have made progress on important chapters.
Such as?
Come back to me and I'll answer that at another time. It's not really the conference for that.
So just finally, I guess, I suppose on the wider legal issues, you feel this is a victory for the government, but is there any sort of statement of regret about the first 9 days?
No, I think during the first 9 days, the government very successfully took New Zealanders on a journey from virtually no restrictions on the way in which they went about their lives to within 9 days having all business premises locked down except for essential services, and people keeping to their bubbles in a way that has saved many lives and has saved billions of dollars of lost output in the economy because we went hard and we went early. Well, yeah, well, I like to win everything in court, but we respect the right of the courts to determine these issues. We've yet to determine whether we will appeal against some or all of these findings. But I'm not being critical of the court, but neither am I being defensive about how the Crown's handled itself in this. Well, I was making the point that we've got to be very careful that we don't overinterpret this judgment. The court wasn't saying that you can't have directions that impact on people's civil liberties without them all being in a written order. And I made that point in respect of the courts themselves calling off jury trials because, of course, even before we had an alert level framework in place, the courts had of their own volition called off jury trials, which effectively took away the rights of people who perhaps were on remand to have their day in court and be set free. So I was making the point that we, as the court have themselves made in this judgment, that you have to see these things in the balance.
I suppose the issues litigated here are taken away by the COVID-19 legislation. And I suppose it's vindicated the fact that actually the Health Act could be used in the way that it was used, which is the COVID-19 legislation is now taking that away. And I guess I know it's early days, but I suppose would you be looking to maybe take the COVID-19 legislation in a streamlined way in which it's interpreted these alert levels and turn it into a more permanent pandemic combating law? Or do you feel actually the Health Act has been vindicated?
Well, in some ways the Health Act's been vindicated because all of the powers that were needed to make orders under level 3 and 4, including the order that they said should have been made a little bit sooner, were found to exist under the Health Act. Where the Health Act is a bit out of date is the way in which decisions are made, because decisions are taken by the Director General of Health rather than by the government through ministers accountable to Parliament through question time. So I would expect that when all of this is passed, and it's not urgent because the system works as it is, that we'll have a look again as to whether the Health Act should use the format that's now in the COVID Response Act, which has ministers taking decisions on advice of the Director General of Health.
Those non-written directives in those first few days, were they? Do you believe that they were vetted, well enough by legal advice and that kind of thing, or do you think there's room for improvement here?
Well, the government always thought we were acting legally, and it's interesting. I went back through the Select Committee appearance that I did, and the questions from the Select Committee weren't really about that whether we got the 3rd of April notice out fast enough. They were whether the legal powers under the Health Act extended to the breadth of orders that we made. Okay? Great. Thanks.